So in 1419, the Kingdom of Bohemia was plunged into chaos as war over religious reformation tore the country apart for 15 years in what would become known as the Hussite Wars. It began with Jan Hus, a Czech priest who had grown disillusioned with the Catholic Church over things like having two popes, even three at one point, and the growing corruption within it, and he was preaching for reformation. And of course the Church didn't like this, denounced him as a heretic, and burnt him at the stake in 1415. Huss though had amassed quite the following in the capital city of Prague, and fun fact, Huss translated to English is geese, so if this happened in England it'll be called the Geese Wars. But anyway, the Hussites weren't too happy about Jan's execution, and they started causing quite the ruckus in order to grow their movement. Their anger rested at one man, King Sigismund of Hungary, who had lured our man Jan to a council under the guise of reformation. However, he was soon convinced by the council that Jan was a heretic, so he had him imprisoned and then burnt at the stake, and he was now claiming that he was going to drown every Hussite in Bohemia. Sigismund already had one hand in the cookie jar of Bohemia, as his brother Wenceslaus IV was king of Bohemia, and in 1419 tensions boiled over, with the Hussites throwing the king's representatives out of the window in what would be the first defenestration of Prague, which is funny because this exact same thing happened 3 times in history. But anyway, apparently the shock of this caused him to die. Sigismund now claimed the crown of Bohemia, although the Hussites weren't too happy about it, and because he wanted to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, which needed the approval of the Pope, he was best buddies with the Pope, and when the Pope called for a crusade against these heretics, Sigismund gladly approved and besieged Prague. However, what Sigismund probably didn't account for is his force of roughly 7,000 to 8,000 Crusader knights being easily beaten off by a peasant force of roughly only 100 to 200 at the Battle of Victor's Hill in 1420, as they were led by the legendary, blind in one eye Jan Žižka, who never lost a battle in his entire military career despite facing overwhelming odds on numerous occasions. What Žižka did so well is install great discipline and leadership into his mainly peasant army and use weapons which required little strength and training, such as crossbows, firearms and agricultural tools, turned weapons which could take out the heavily armoured knights of the time, as well as his use and development of the famed wagenburg. The wagenburg was a bunch of wagons chained together on the battlefield to form a defensive fortification, and these would be filled with men with polearms, crossbows, flails, firearms with cannons in between them, and this formed an extremely effective counter to the heavy cavalry charges of the time and allowed Žižka and his peasant army with little to no training to close the gap between the knights who had trained all their life for this moment. After pushing the First Crusade out of Bohemia, they were soon met with a second anti-Hussite crusade led by Sigismund less than a year later, and Žižka, who was now blind in both eyes after suffering an injury during a siege, managed to beat off the Crusaders once again on numerous occasions despite overwhelming odds. However, the Hussites had their problems. There was 2 internal factions of them, and they had their differences. There was the Taborites, who were demanding more radical religious reformation, and they were led by Jan Zizka, and the Utraquists, who were more moderate. And while they did put their differences aside for the Crusades, and after Jan Žižka beat the Utraquists in 1423, these problems still persisted throughout the Hussite Wars. Unfortunately for the Hussites though, disaster struck as their leader Jan Žižka passed away in 1424 at the age of 63 from what is believed to be a bacterial infection during a siege, and his dying wish was for his skin to be laid over drums so he could still lead his men into battle, and those men he did leave behind now started calling themselves the orphans as they had lost their father. And this statue of him, which is the 3rd largest bronze equestrian statue in the world, is located on Victor's Hill, where he won his first great victory over the Crusaders. While a third anti-Hussite crusade, which was called just before Žižka's passing, failed to materialise, a 4th anti-Hussite crusade was now called as they believed the Hussites would be at their weakest with their leader gone. However, their demise was greatly exaggerated as the 4th anti-Hussite crusade was greatly beaten off by a new Hussite leader, Prokop the Great. The Hussites now began to push back as they launched what they called glorious raids into neighbouring territories to dissuade future Crusader participation from them. And with this string of victory after victory after victory after victory, with no losses, the church now thought, fuck, we probably have to do something about this Hussite movement that's not a crusade, which allows compromise so their ideas don't start spreading further. However, nothing came of this, so they did what they thought was best, and that was to call a fifth anti-Hussite crusade, and you can probably guess how it went. It was also beaten off by the Hussites, with apparently the Crusaders fleeing upon seeing the Hussite banners and hearing their song, "Ye who are warriors of God," with the Hussites pursuing them and then slaughtering them in a forest. In 1433, tensions between the two rival Hussite factions once again boiled over at the Battle of Lipany, whereas this time the more moderate Utraquists claiming victory over the more radical Taborites, and this allowed the Utraquists to become the dominant Hussite faction and go to the bargaining table with the Roman Church, allowing compromises to allow them to practice their religion in churches. The 15-year war which tore Bohemia apart was finally over, with Sigismund finally being recognised as the King of Bohemia. However, Jan Hus and his Hussites had opened Pandora's box into the new ideas in the way the church would work, which would tear Europe apart for the next centuries.